So here with Steph and John, thanks guys for coming, and we're going to be talking today about cultivating habits of celebration and lament in our lives. This is part of a bigger church series we've been doing on Sundays, and so we've looked at habits of a disciple. The series has been called Cultivating Habits of a Disciple. What's it look like to do that? And we've covered a number of things. So we covered habits of scripture and prayer in a world of distraction and self-determinism, fasting and simplicity in a world of much, confession and worship in a world of individualism and cynicism, submission and service in a world of me first, silence and solitude last week in a world of busyness and noise. And then today we're going to be looking at celebration and lament. And so really excited to have this conversation, and just to sort of acknowledge just from the offset, as soon as we start talking about, particularly when we talk about lament, then we are touching on things that are really quite emotionally vulnerable moments in our lives, in people's lives. And so just sort of want to be mindful of that, and I'm sure in our conversations that we carry the tone of that there's a sensitivity there to be mindful of. And so, yeah, but it'd be maybe good just to start with some definitions. So I don't know whether, Steph, you might just begin just with defining what is it to celebrate. What does celebration mean in this context?
Sure, yeah. So celebration, we might think of the obvious, like birthdays and weddings and festivals. And they're all wonderful, good ways that we celebrate. But when we're thinking about this spiritual practice of celebration, we're thinking more about how we're cultivating a practice and an attitude of joy and of gratitude in our everyday lives, no matter what our circumstances are. And so really, I think celebration is really about the good recognition of God's goodness in us, around us, in the good things that he's given us.
It's brilliant. And then, John, if you could just define, what do we mean by lament?
So the way I would look at lament is where we connect at a deeper level, in entering into the reality of life's pain and disappointment and anguish. And that can be both in ourselves, but also in what we see around us. So it can be the experiences of our own life, but also the world we see around us and the pain that we see around us. And in that, being able to express and give voice to that pain. And that's both our own pain, but at times also the pain of God, because of the pain that he experiences as he sees his world. And as you alluded to at the beginning, that this can be an uncomfortable subject, and so as well as for us to have that sensitivity as we're talking with one another, I think it's helpful maybe for anyone who's listening to maybe just recognize that this may be uncomfortable even to listen to. It may bring up discomfort, but to be able to think about it, if we avoid lament in our lives, in some ways we avoid something of the reality of life, and we therefore avoid in some ways the way that God experiences the world. And so his invitation to us is not only to press into lament for our own good, but also for how God sees the world. So I just really encourage people as they're listening to stay with the conversation and maybe just acknowledge that discomfort as we go.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I think so. We've been in this whole series, we've been sort of asking the question: how do we look a little bit more like Jesus? In a year's time from how we are today. Or if, you can take that further. Like, what do we need? What can we build into our lives on a regular, habitual basis that over the course of like 20 years sets a trajectory for sort of looking more and more like Jesus? And so that's been the thought with the things we've been looking at so far, and similarly today. And so this isn't like about suddenly like a total gear shift in our lives, but it's just about building these habits of celebration and lament into our lives, and allowing space for them to help us look increasingly like Jesus, because there are things that we see in the Bible, we see them in Jesus, but we see them sort of, they have there's lots of examples of both of these things in the biblical narrative and story. And so I wonder, John, whether you might just start just talking, if we sort of focus in on lament a little bit, where do we see that in the Bible?
So like, if you think like the Bible as a story arc, that there are many different facets to that, but one of those would be lament. So I've just finished the book of Job in my Bible in a year.
Lots in there,
and there's lots in there about lament. Comes with a health warning to read it. But the very fact it's in the Bible, and the very fact in the Psalms, almost half of the Psalms are Psalms of lament, is almost God's saying this is part of life. The like Psalms and Job and the prophets, as you read through the Old Testament and the prophets, and much of what they're talking about is lament over the state of the world and the state of the people of God and the injustice that they see around them, and they give voice to that in there. And then when we sort of go forward to Jesus, that Jesus himself was described as a man of sorrows, and Jesus wept. He wept when he lost his friend Lazarus. He wept when he looked over and he saw the state of Jerusalem and what was happening in Jerusalem. And so part of the story arc of the Bible is a story of lament.
Yeah. We see him in the Garden of Gethsemane in anguish, and and even on the cross, like using the language of the Psalms. God, where are you, God?
And then there's the invitation to that we will pick up our cross. We will carry our cross. We will enter his sufferings, and so it's throughout the Bible.
I mean, I think at some of the more difficult times in my life, I remember finding the Psalms, Ecclesiastes, and Lamentations like really helpful. Not because they necessarily gave me information that I needed, or they didn't solve any problems. I think the language I always use to explain it is I felt understood by them, and I felt like I could read Lamentations and Ecclesiastes particularly and just feel like, I'm understood by this. It's not trying to sort of make everything suddenly feel fine or feel better, but it's just, I felt recognized and seen, and really. So it's there. It's all the way through. So I wonder what just to speak personally of your experience of this habit, this work, practice of lament. What that's looked like in your lives. I don't know, Steph, whether.
Yeah, sure, I can talk about it. It's funny to call it a practice or a habit when it's sort of something that just happens to you in some regards, in the sense of what might provoke lament. Happens in your life, happens around you, and it's like a response, I guess, that we have, a natural response that we can have to, difficult experiences. And for me personally, going back about 10 years was probably the first time I really learned how to lament. I went through a traumatic loss. It was my first experience of real grief of that kind. I had no language for it, didn't have any frame of reference, and it felt quite hidden. And for those around me, it just felt like they needed me to just, pull my socks up, carry on. I was a mum of 2 young children, I had to just get on with life. And it felt quite difficult, I think, to sort of have this deep pain, this grief that didn't know how to express. And, to the world around me, I was just sort of masking really and suppressing it quite a lot. But I think in my relationship with God at that time, I think I'd somehow come to believe too that they were unwelcome emotions. I think I'd skipped over Lamentations and Ecclesiastes and not really sort of taken in that these were things God wanted to hear and cared about, rather than, it created distance for me in my relationship with God. And so, over a period of time after really getting to a critical point where I just needed some help. I got some counselling, and that was really where I was able to bring words, honest words, to what was going on, began to put language to it. And it was a process. It was over time that then became what I would call a lament, where I was able to actually speak honestly to God, and know that he was listening and receiving what I was saying. And that's sort of been my experience, and that helped me to then be able to talk about it with other people, helps me talk about it now. And obviously that's took a long time, and I think that's the thing with lament, is that it's a process. It's not a one time only thing. It can be a season of life that we go through, and there can be different aspects of it. But in the midst of that, I was able to eventually hold my trust and faith in God. Almost that intention. It was like, on the one hand, there's this deep pain and sorrow, and how could you let this happen, God? But also this real deep trust that God is in it and with me in it, and he's good. And somehow I was able to get there. I'm in deep pain, but God is with me. But yeah, that took time.
Yeah, I love that. I think it's so interesting that you're saying at the beginning, it feels strange to call it a discipline or a habit. And I agree, because it almost feels like it's just needy. But the language, even I forgot to say at the start, but this was called sort of Celebration and Lament in a World Masking Emotions.
Yeah.
And I think the danger is, and potentially often the go-to is, to get busy, just be distracted, just that can sit over there, and we're just going to ignore that, and then it festers and it grows, and it has all, and actually it has so many different sort of, it has its influence on your life, doesn't it? You're just sort of hiding it. And I suppose in some ways what we're saying is, in our world and culture, it almost needs to be a habit and a discipline to say, oh, I'm gonna quite intentionally sort of almost run against the grain with this, and I'm gonna like look at the stuff that's hurting me. And also, just, I was thinking, as you were saying, I think there's something very precious about the vulnerability. It's very honest, isn't it, to say to God, this is how I'm feeling, and that's the beauty of Job and the Psalms, like you saying. It's just so honest, but honesty is very vulnerable, isn't it? You're only honest with people when you're like, the people that you're honest with are the people that you feel safe enough to be vulnerable with. And so I think that level of honesty and vulnerability is simultaneously a place of intimacy, and so you hold these things. It's like, a trust God, here's my pain, and I'm coming to you straight with it, completely, vulnerably, honestly. This is how I'm feeling. Like like in a family, if you have a really healthy parent-child relationship, you would have, the parent is the child expresses and brings their emotions to the parent, because that's their place where they feel safe, and in fact they mask where they don't feel safe, and they and so I think there's something very precious about that, both the sort of the vulnerability and intimacy of it, but also the need to sort of, we need to actually be quite almost intentionally push into it, because it's probably not modeled all over for us, So what about you, John? What you experienced?
So because obviously we thought before today about this, and coincidentally it was actually about 10 years ago for myself.
Yeah, same as
Strangely,
2016.
Yeah, quite a
Tough year.
Quite a year. But so in 2016, we lost my dad. My dad died, and it was a few years after having lost my mum to cancer. And because in many ways, after my mum had died, we'd gone, as a family, we'd gone into caring for my dad, and so there was probably a lot of unresolved grief there. And it coincided with, and in some ways probably connected with it, around that time I experienced something I'd never really experienced in any great way before, but I went through quite a prolonged period of social anxiety. So if I was in large family spaces, large church spaces, not being the ideal place for that. So it was just it was like a daily part of life that I was walking through. And so what that meant was that in some ways, all my mechanisms of coping and achieving were challenged because I was sort of getting through the day, and so it meant that then I was engaging in things like things that were like unresolved grief and just things in life being unresolved, and also this thing of why am I experiencing this in these spaces, and like Steph was talking about some of that being the things that she experienced being hidden, and I think often for us, we'll go on and we'll talk about probably lament for the world and all of those things, but often it's the things that are hidden, and that's where it can be hard, and that's where you spoke about Lamentations and Ecclesiastes, and just finding those places which gave voice to the things that I was experiencing that I probably couldn't easily give voice to, and so it really was a transformative time in terms of my faith, because the things that I would speak to others about faith, I was now having to embrace and in some ways question, what do I believe? And I came out of that time in a very different but much stronger place in my faith, because my faith wasn't just that God can do things, my faith was that God is who he says he is, and lament was part of that. And as I say, it's not a structured thing we do, or it's not in itself just a practice, but entering into the place of pain and choosing to enter into that place. That's in some ways that's the practice.
Yeah.
It's the choice to say, I'm going to go here, and I'm going to do that with God, and I'm going to do it with others.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that was part of my
It's
experience.
Oh, thanks guys for sharing. I know it's like it is vulnerable, so thank you for sharing those things. I guess to just sort of change tack a little bit, but to move from into the practice of celebration. What about that from a biblical point of view? I know there's like lots of points in the Bible where you see that happening both corporately and individually, and but Steph, do you want to say a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think it's interesting as well that actually some of the practices of celebration that we see in the Bible do actually come out of a time of real adversity and challenge. And, the Jewish culture is entrenched with, it's intrinsic to their culture to have times of celebration. Festivals mark different times of the year.
Yeah, real peak moments in the year. Yeah.
Where they gather together, they'd feast, celebrate. There'd be music and dancing. There'd also be aspects of sacrifice and worship, and a lot of remembering and storytelling, remembering what it is that God has done and why we're celebrating. I think of the deliverance, following the Exodus, and it's like this celebration that they remember and retell the stories and keep, God at the center. And so it's often his faithfulness, his provision, his deliverance that the Jewish culture, we see them celebrating. And then, of course, we have the weekly Sabbath, the weekly discipline of resting, stopping our work, taking time to delight in God and give thanks for the good things that he's given us that week, and trusting him in the laying down our work that he's provided. My favourite, I think, is the year of Jubilee, which is this celebration we read of in the Old Testament every 50 years, where it's radical. I mean, wow, if we did this today, it's so radical that they would cancel all debts, they would return land to their former owners, they would set slaves free. Everything would be like, it's like this national reset, and it's like this restorative thing. So there's lots of those kind of different ways of celebrating. And then, of course, we've got the Psalms, which, is full of praise and thanksgiving to God. And I think the Psalms really tell us who God is. It reminds us who God is. And I think particularly perhaps in times of difficulty, they can give words to our prayers and give us reminders of who God is and celebrate who God is when we might not be able to find the words ourselves. And then we go into the New Testament and celebration continues. I mean, Jesus was known as someone who celebrated and was criticized for it by the Pharisees because he had a good time.
Yeah. There's someone who says in one of the Gospels, Jesus is basically like either on his way to, or just leaving a meal.
Yeah.
Like
yeah.
every
Yeah, and so food is really central, gathering together. And I'd love to have been at those tables, But yeah, celebration of, Jesus is in town, we see people get baptized, healed. There's a real sense of the whole town is in celebration and awe of what God has done. We think of when Jesus fed the 5,000 and, they came back for more. But then I think that sense of, it coming out of adversity in the worst of circumstances, somehow joy seems to rise to the surface for believers. And I think of, Acts 16, where Paul and Silas are in prison and they're somehow in chains, decide to worship and sing to God. And it must have been a survival. I'd have been in survival mode in that place, just bring light in the darkness in this prison. But we see this like multiplication of joy that happens because in their joyful singing, the other prisoners hear it, it says, and the jailer, there's an earthquake and the jail's doors are opened, and in that story, that we find the jailer falling to his knees, and him and his whole household. The story tells us, they end with being filled with joy from being coming to faith in God and celebrating and being baptized. And so I think, it's just incredible how these themes of celebration are woven through.
Yeah, I was thinking, you're saying that the letter of Philippians.
Yes. Yeah.
Like a lot of commentators think, it's written most probably from a prison context, but it's known as being like the most joyful of Paul's letters. And it's just amazing, like, joy in adversity. But I was thinking, as you were saying, actually, there's moments where our hearts just overflow on, we're just, because it's the overflow of like how, what's going on at the moment or something. But again, back to the sort of the discipline, the habit of it, I suppose there are points where actually it's good to cultivate a habit of celebrating and of gratitude, maybe even in moments where things feel difficult, and sort of allowing space for that, but kind of intentionally. And I think there's moments, sometimes as a family, often at dinner time we'll do this thing where we just say, let's just say two best things from the day, like two things that we're grateful for, and again, it's not like therefore every day's been fantastic, but it's just sort of trying to help tilt something of our time together towards like gratitude, and recognizing what we have. So what about, so maybe just some like your personal experience of this as a thing?
Just think about when God first really started to nudge me towards this practice. I think going back about 15 years ago, I was a pretty glass half empty thinker. I was so locked into seeing what was missing in my life, what's lacking, what's limiting, what's lost. And I was in that time, in that season, I think, in my resistance to lament, probably. I saw the world very, very differently to how I see it now, and I was just very glass half empty thinking, and it had me in a place of hopelessness, really. Even despairing at times. I must have been very awful to be around, but in that time, I remember reading the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000, and something, just how God moved in that story for me in that time was just so, I think, just profound. And I just saw something in that story that was new to me, as God can surprise us in scripture. And I remember as I was reading, I was just seeing, the two disciples, Philip and Andrew, when Jesus says, you feed the crowd. And they have two fairly similar responses, but there was just this slight difference between Andrew to Philip. And, Philip's like seeing the impossibility of the situation. It's not possible to feed this crowd with what we have. It would take months of wages. And that was kind of my way of thinking, like, it's all too much and everything is doomed. And and I laugh about it now, but in all seriousness, it was my worldview, it was my way of thinking, and it was not an easy place to live from. But God was doing something in this story, and he was showing me just how Andrew, saw the impossibility of the situation too. But I think he knew something of Jesus that gave him perhaps this sense of promise that, in spite of what was lacking in that situation, he found the boy with the bread and the fish and he offered it to Jesus. And I think I just saw that, as an invitation to me to move from the glass half empty to the glass half full. It was just a change in perspective. And I just remember from that day just beginning to notice small, seemingly little offerings, and I would just offer, just like Andrew offered that bread and fish to Jesus, and he prayed for it, he gave thanks to it, and it multiplied. It felt like that's what happened with my little offerings of gratitude. It was like the more I focused on the good, the more I was able to set my mind on those things rather than on what was lacking or missing or what was impossible. Somehow, over time, long time, but that gratitude practice really transformed my way of thinking. It restored hope to me ultimately.
Yeah.
That's been my little experience, and I think that's radically changed my life now. I see the world very differently. I hope I'm not a glass half empty thinker anymore.
That's amazing. I think I don't know much. I don't know anything about these things, but Lizzie and I look at a book at the moment. It's sort of about the neurobiology of that thing, and the importance of training your brain towards the positive and towards the happiness. And particularly, I think I guess family wise, for probably I have a tendency, like you had, to be a bit more like, this like perfectionist sort of element of me that's like, I want it to be this, and if it's not, then I just see all, it might be 98% good, but all my energy is on that 2%, and so just been reading some stuff about that at the moment. It's fascinating that how important that is, and we've reflected. Lizzie was reflecting yesterday about exactly that you often you read these things in sort of secular books or whatever, and then you're like, oh, it's just like what it says in the Bible. It's just like, it's interesting. There's so many things that you read, and then you realize that, gosh, that's exactly what we've been encouraged to do in the Bible. That same thing. So how about you, John?
I think I was struck when Steph was just saying about that, noticing maybe tendencies in herself, and I think it's probably quite helpful for us to pay attention to where our leanings might be. So it might be we might lean more towards the glass half full, the melancholy, and others maybe lean the other way where we don't want to go there, and just I guess paying and paying attention to that as we go. So there'd be over Christmas, like the season leading up to Christmas, there'd been a lot of stuff going on that was quite difficult, just in life, and also just seeing what feels like quite a chaotic state around us in the world at the moment and what have you, and I found myself like struggling with that, and as I was thinking about the New Year, the thing that came to me was that a sense of, I can tend to think that because I see those things, and just in terms of part of my role, it means I encounter all that stuff, I sort of can think, I see the world as it really is, and those that we've got to talk about a quiet revival on the one hand, and we've got cultural chaos on the other, and you might have one person that's leaning into the cultural chaos and someone else that's leaning into the quiet revival, and each of us might think, I see the world as it is, but actually God sees the world as it is. And so what I found, like in terms of like this year, is in terms of, I've started doing the Bible in a year again, almost to be able to bring some of that balance in my own life is that because it's both, and God is doing amazing things and in people's lives, and he's also present in the pain of the world, and it's going on at the same time. And so I found actually just literally that almost the mundanity of each day reading the Bible, whatever verse it is, whatever psalm it is, whatever Old Testament, New Testament passage it is for the day, it almost brings a leveling in that is, part of the celebration is, God's in charge. God's in charge. And so for me, sometimes it's some of the prayer practices that can be quite mundane. So I use one of the books I think we might refer to later is called Every Moment Holy, and they have some just prayer liturgies that you can use, and I sort of regularly use that because it engages with both essentially words of lament and words of celebration, and some of those words are quite mundane, but it means that you're engaging with the both, and hopefully starting to see the world as it really is, not through just the lens that I have of the world, which might tend to lean in one direction.
Yeah.
So.
It's really helpful. Really helpful. This morning I often walk the dog early, and this morning I sort of intentionally, as I was walking the dog, had this like gratitude. I need to do almost like a gratitude walk, because I was feeling a bit sort of sorry for myself probably, and maybe it started it's kind of start with a slightly sort of, here's all the here's and this and this and this, I'm annoyed about this, and I was like, I should try and practice gratitude. I mean, we're talking about like celebration today. I was like, I should probably. So then I was like, okay, what can I be grateful for? And I mean, it was low bar for sure. But the first thing that came to mind, and I actually did praise, was like, Lord, thank you that that I have enough breath in my body. I have breath in my body such that I can complain and just tell you everything that I'm annoyed about. And I was like, well, at least I could, if you just, aside from like everything's going well, but just like, actually, no, I am breathing. Like, and that's amazing. That's a gift. I should thank you, Lord, that I'm alive to complain to you. Thank you that I have words that I can complain to you with. Thank you that I have breath that I can complain to you. Thank you that I have a mind that can be, aware enough to complain. Thank you that I'm on this walk, and and I've got this space to actually complain. It was, and then begin to recognize, oh goodness me, like there's so much gift even underneath often the things that feel very difficult. But being aware that, like, man, this is my tendency, or maybe in any given moment I'm leaning this way. And it's helpful to just have things to help bring some balance. So that concludes part 1 of our conversation. Thanks for listening. Do join us for part 2.